Hello and welcome to the inaugural podcast of By the Book. I'm Nicholas Hebert and I'm here with L. Joseph Hebert, the author of the blog By the Book. All right, let's start with an introduction. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I am a husband and a father of 3 beautiful children. I am a professor. I teach in a political science department. My specialty is political philosophy.
What's political philosophy and how is it different than political science?
Well, political philosophy, I would say, is sort of the grandfather of political science. The original political scientists were, political science emerged out of political philosophy. If we start with the idea of philosophy, philosophy is ancient Greek, and it comes from 2 words, philia, which is love, and sophia, which is wisdom. So it's a love of wisdom, and it's a particular understanding of it. What do we mean by wisdom? Well, wisdom is the highest form of knowledge. So it could be, absolutely speaking, a knowledge of the highest causes in the universe. In terms of human life, it could be a knowledge of things like what leads to a good life, a happy, fulfilling life, and also thinking about the connections between those things, the universe as a whole and human life. So what does it mean to love philosophy or love wisdom? Philia is a love of friendship or kinship, so it's like a love of father and son, husband and wife, or close friends. So what do those things have in common? The idea of philia is that you're close to somebody because you live with them, you share life with them, you're sharing your life with them on an ongoing basis. So I think that's one of the root meanings of philosophy, is that you're devoting your life to wisdom, you're pursuing wisdom, and then whatever wisdom you find, you're trying to apply that to your life and make sure that your life is suffused with wisdom.
Okay, but what about the politics? Where does that come in with philosophy?
Well, this is of course, we think of the word politics, all kinds of things come to mind. How does that fit in with philosophy? Some of them would seemingly be the opposite. Philosophy about pursuing wisdom, politics, we think of conflict, we think of maybe partisanship, closed-mindedness, and things like that. I have a whole blog post about just this question: what does politics have to do with philosophy? It doesn't seem to mix. Well, I'm really interested in how they do mix. So what would I say? Well, politics is looking at a really crucial part of the order in which we live as human beings. A lot of the order we live in is natural. We live in a natural order, our own biology, the nature around us, geography, these things are all natural. The ecosystem and things like that. But then there's something else that superimposes itself on this, which is not exactly natural per se, but is it's an inescapable part of the context in which we live, and that's the political order. So think about, say, Europe under the Germanic tribes of old. Think about Europe after it was conquered by the Romans and the Roman Empire. Think about Europe during the Middle Ages, or Europe during the early modern Industrial Revolution, and Europe today under contemporary, modern democratic governments. It's the same geography, it's the same nature, but it'd be a very different experience living in Europe in those different contexts. Why? It's because of the political order. So the political order is not just about arguments we have or different positions we take. It's much broader and deeper than that. It's about the entire framework in which we live as human beings, insofar as we're determining that with things like the political regime, the political order that we set up and that we maintain, and that we also change as we go along.
So what got you interested in political philosophy?
Well, I think, for me, basically, it was asking questions about my own life and about my relationships with other people, and about, for me, it was very personal. It was trying to understand the meaning of life and the nature of things. And I wasn't so attracted at first to the political side of that. But gradually, as I studied philosophy and ethics and things of that nature, it increasingly dawned on me that you can't separate the life you're living from political society as a whole, and you need to think very critically about how those things relate to each other.
That makes sense. Can you give an example of how political philosophy has influenced the world or made a difference?
Okay, well, as a professor, I can't resist giving you a little lecture here. So, Nicholas, if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen here. So, Nicholas, you asked, how does political philosophy relate to the world? Now, often we have the tendency to think, oh, what's happening right now? Like, what's the latest news and how does it relate to that? You could relate it to that, but consider that the world we live in was not made, 5 minutes ago, right? It's been developing over the centuries. What have been the greatest influences that have shaped the world that we're living in? They're not necessarily things of yesterday or the day before yesterday. So one figure we can look at who I would argue has shaped our world dramatically is Socrates. And as we see here, he lived from 470 to 399 BC. And what did Socrates do or say, or what is his, what's the big deal about him? Well, I'm going to start with a text, and I'm going to do this because a lot of what we do in political philosophy is to analyze texts and to try to glean whatever wisdom we can get out of them and see how the wisdom that these texts contain has applied and might apply in the future. So if you look at a text, one of the things you want to do is to analyze it in its own terms, but also look at the context. Like where and why and how is this being said, and how does the context make a difference? So we'll start with a very famous saying. Probably everybody has heard this saying by Socrates: the unexamined life is not worth living. Now what does this mean? We could wonder what he means by the examined life or the unexamined life. And in a nutshell, he's talking about philosophy, which we just discussed a minute ago. Okay? Socrates is the quintessential philosopher. He's come down in history as being, he wasn't not the first philosopher, but he is probably the earliest philosopher who became so famous for the way he philosophized that it has shaped all philosophy after that. And so he's talking about the philosophical life, and he's saying that it's somehow, life is not worth living if we don't philosophize or we don't examine our lives. Now, if we looked at a statement like that today, we might think, oh, he's expressing his opinion, right? This is a value statement. This is something Socrates believes, or he feels that philosophy is so important that he just wouldn't want to live without it. But this would be a serious misunderstanding of what Socrates is trying to say. So I'm going to unpeel it just a little bit at a time. First of all, if we look at a slightly more complete slicing of the statement, he says the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. Not, for me, Socrates, it wouldn't be worth living, but for a human being. Now, why is that important? I'm going to bring a little context here in terms of philosophical terminology. A term that Socrates talks about quite a bit is virtue. And the word virtue, we use it a little bit today, but we don't so often use it in its classical sense. In the classical sense that Socrates is using virtue, it means something very specific, and in fact, I think the best definition we can use is specific excellence. So excellence means being in the best possible condition. And specific, what that means is the species. So consider, for example, that what it means to be an excellent horse is not the same thing as what it means to be an excellent dog, or what it means to be an excellent tree, or an excellent rose bush. And none of those would be the same as what it means to be an excellent human being. So to understand excellence, we have to know what the species or what kind of thing something is. And when we know what kind of thing it is, then we can think about how is it being perfected? How would you make that kind of being be the best that it can be? How can you help it to achieve its potential? So when he says the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, he is indicating that something about what it means to live a virtuous or an excellent human life. Philosophy is essential to that. You can't achieve excellence as a human being without something that philosophy is providing. So it's a bold statement, but it's not an expression of his personal opinion. It's an expression of something that he's perceiving about the nature of things. It's a claim that he's making about the nature of things. So in other words, we could talk about human nature. He's saying that it's part of human nature that, for example, well, I'll move to the next slide, and then we'll look at how he gets to this conclusion. So if we look at a little bit broader, back up a little bit, he's making a speech, and this is the slightly longer version of what he says. I say that this even happens to be a very great good for a human being to make speeches every day about virtue and the other things about which you hear me conversing and examining, both myself and others, and that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. So this confirms what we were saying, that when he says not worth living, the flip side of that is that for a human being it is a very great good. It's a good that is actually essential to living a good life for a human being. It's something about our nature. And what is it about our nature that points us towards philosophy, seeking wisdom? He says it's making speeches, and the word here in Greek is logoi. It's the plural of logos, which could be translated as speech or reason or argument. So if you consider, for example, what does it mean to be an excellent tree? Let's say you're walking in the park and you see this giant, majestic oak tree, and you're just in awe of the beauty and the majesty of this tree. That, by the way, is a major sign of excellence. When you admire something or someone, that's a sign of excellence. It could be that the person or the thing is completely excellent in every way, or it could be some specific thing about them is excellent and you notice it and you're in admiration. So take an excellent oak tree. Is the oak tree thinking about what it means to be an excellent oak tree? Is it reasoning or arguing about what it means to be an excellent oak tree? No, because it's not the nature of an oak tree to reason or to think. And it doesn't need to reason or think to be an excellent oak tree. Same thing with a horse or a dog. An excellent horse or dog doesn't have to think about what it means to be an excellent horse or dog, because thinking is not part, thinking in the sense of reasoning about the meaning of things is not part of being a horse or a dog at all. However, when you get to a human being, that's different, because human beings are rational animals. Reasoning, thinking is constitutive of who we are. Think about yourself. Who would you be without your thoughts and your opinions and your perceptions of things? You wouldn't be the person that you are. So, speaking about virtue, and really what he's implying is speaking virtuously about virtue, speaking well about virtue, is part of virtue for a human being, because that's part of our nature. Our nature is to be reasonable, to think, and to reason. So without it, we can't be an excellent human being. Does that make sense so far, Nicholas?
Yes, it is, yeah.
All right, excellent. Now, let's look at some further context of why this was so important, because it's very interesting so far, hopefully. But why does this have such a big impact on the world? Well, a further context is Socrates says this when he's on trial, and he's going to be found guilty, and he's going to be sentenced to death and executed. For what? For philosophizing, for doing philosophy. So bear in mind, political philosophy is something that it started off in history as being a capital crime. Now, how is this considered to be criminal? The accusation is quoted here. Socrates does injustice by corrupting the young and by not believing in the gods in whom the city believes. So they take his reasoning, his argumentation, his questioning, his philosophizing, what is the meaning of life and what is virtue and so forth. They take this as a threat to the beliefs of the city, and therefore it's a corruption of the young. And why do you suppose that's important, Nicholas? Why would the city of Athens be so afraid of that he's teaching the young to question what they believe in?
Well, they might be afraid that then the young are going to try to change things in a way that's not beneficial for them.
Absolutely. The young are the future, right? In the next generation, the leaders of the city will be taken from that pool of young people that he's talking to. And if they don't believe in the gods in whom the city believes, then they're going to take the city in an entirely different direction. And so the current leadership is very afraid of that, right? They don't like being questioned. They don't like their wisdom being questioned. Now let's take a look at what Socrates was doing that provoked this response. This is Socrates' own summary of what he was asking, the kinds of questions he was asking. Who is knowledgeable in such virtue, that of a human being and citizen? So I'm going to note a few things about this. First of all, Socrates is asking who knows, right? He's not claiming that he knows, and that's an interesting aspect of this, but he's questioning who knows. So the answer could be, or the people in charge would like to say, well, we know. That's why we're in charge, right? But what if the answer doesn't come out that way? That could be a threat to those in authority. If they don't know what virtue is, then what are they doing in authority, right? Now, look at the way he breaks down virtue, that of a human being and a citizen. Just like we were saying before, philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom, and wisdom is something that is grounded, as we can see, in nature, the way things are, with or without human input. So human nature is what it is. We don't make ourselves to be what we are. We just find ourselves that way. This is what a human being is. We can't change the fact that human beings are rational and trees are not rational. Okay, so the virtue of a human being is going to be something universal and by nature. But a citizen, what makes a good citizen? As we noted, political regimes change over time and place. In different times and places, the political regime could be very different. And they have different views about what's good. So for example, Athens, they didn't like Socrates philosophizing, and he's saying, but that's what virtue is for a human being. And they're saying, well, you may think so, but that makes you a bad citizen of Athens. So here's the thing about this, is that as Socrates well understood, there could be a conflict between what's virtuous by nature and what's considered virtuous by the political regime. On the other hand, human nature is such not only that we're rational, but we're also political. We cannot live outside the context of political society. And to see why that is, consider that as a rational animal by nature, we think and we reason. But when we think and reason, just consider your own thoughts at the moment. For most of you, you're probably thinking in English. Maybe some people listening to this, maybe you have a different, first language that you're thinking in. But could you think without language? Could you do that, Nicholas?
I can't.
No, I can't do that. And where did you get the language that you think in? Did you make it up on your own?
No, I did not.
None of us made the language that we think in, right? And so what could be more intimate about ourselves than our own thoughts? And yet our own thoughts are couched in a language which in itself is basically a set of rules about meaning and syntax and grammar and all these things, and we can't think or reason without that. So what that means is that the philosopher can't solve this problem by just running away from political society and say, well, you guys are just ignorant and I'm going to go philosophize in the mountains. That doesn't solve the problem, because even if he's in the mountains, he's going to be philosophizing in Greek or English, or he's still going to be connected and shaped by the political society. And so that would be contrary to his own insight that we're actually political by nature. And we need to face that conflict, that tension between nature and society. We have to deal with that. We have to try to reconcile those things. And that's the challenge, the drama and the challenge of political philosophy in a nutshell. Many political philosophers over the centuries have been put to death or otherwise, hounded and bothered and harassed because they're living in that tension. They're drawing attention to the tension between nature and society. And we see that here in this next quotation. He's summarizing his life of questioning people. And what he finds is those with the best reputations, those who are considered wise by themselves and others, they seem to be nearly the most deficient in my investigation. In other words, they were vain. They were vainglorious people. They were full of themselves, and other people were, thinking they were wise. But when he would ask questions, he would find that they were not. And he says that his investigation was in accordance with the God. Now, what does he mean by that? This is a very interesting dynamic of his defense speech, which I won't probe into too much. I'll just say this, that in ancient Athens, they believed in the gods of Homer, like Zeus, Athena, Hermes, and things like that. In Plato's Republic, Socrates, there he's in a private conversation, and he says, a just society, a wise society, would not believe in the gods of Homer. Why? Because those gods are irrational, they're unjust, they're criminals. Zeus himself, the king of the gods, is going around committing crimes in the stories that Homer tells. He commits crimes. So he says, this is not a rational belief system. A rational belief system, he says, in the Republic would be, you believe that there's one God, and he is good, and he's reasonable, and he's just. And so the whole cosmos, the whole universe makes sense. Okay, well, so he's being ironic with the people of Athens. He doesn't come out and say, I don't believe in your gods, I believe in a different God, but he's dropping hints repeatedly. So the important thing here is to see that his God is not the gods they believe in. His God is a rational God, a reasonable God. And so investigating in accordance with the God that is in accordance with reason, he finds that these people don't really understand what they claim to understand because they contradict themselves and they fall into all kinds of fallacies. While others with more paltry reputations seemed to be men more fit in regard to being prudent. So prudence is a practical reason. So we see that Socrates is appealing to reason as an essential part of our nature, and he also connects it to God and the cosmos as a whole. That the natural order in which we live is reasonable because it's overseen by a divine mind that is reasonable. So he culminates here by connecting the dots, between his search for wisdom and the people who falsely claim to be wise and so forth. He says, I asked myself on behalf of the oracle, he's talking about the oracle of Delphi, which is the god they believe in. And the way he treats it here shows that he doesn't actually believe in the Delphic oracle, he just believes in the god of reason. I asked myself on behalf of the oracle whether I would prefer to be as I am, being in no way wise in their wisdom or ignorant in their ignorance, or to have both things that they have. I answered myself in the oracle that it profits me to be just as I am. Now, why does it profit him? We've seen that in the earlier quotation, which actually comes later, where he says that this is a very great good for a human being to reason about virtue and to follow reason, to think reasonably and rationally about these things rather than to assert things without knowing what we're talking about. So how does this all come to a head? And this is the final point I'm going to make about Socrates. He presents a challenge to the city which has echoed through the centuries. He does not reject political society. He says, I, men of Athens, salute you and I love you. And that's very important to bear in mind, because Socrates understands that it's essential that we live in a well-ordered political society. We have to show respect for the law and authority. But on the other hand, law and authority are not doing us any good if they are against nature. They're against our nature as human beings, and they're preventing us from living a good life. So he therefore calls attention to the higher law that the political authorities have to adhere to. And he says, I will obey the God rather than you. And as long as I breathe and am able to, I will certainly not stop philosophizing. So nature comes first. God and nature come first, and then the political society. That's the formula that Socrates is giving us. So I'll stop there for a second. Does it all make sense, Nicholas, or do you have any particular questions about that?
No, it makes a lot of sense, Dr. Hebert.
Okay. Well, you may be wondering what's happened since 399 BC, right?
Yes, yeah. How does this relate to the modern world?
How does it relate to the modern world? Well, I'm not going to go all the way till today, because that would be a long podcast. I'm just going to take one example of, for us anyhow, the country that we live in. And it dates back to 1776, the Declaration of Independence, when the former colonies of Great Britain declared independence. And here's a statement they make. And I want to look at it and see how it relates to what we just looked at from 400 BC. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to this separation. So you notice that what they're doing is dissolving the political bands. And they're not doing this in a way that suggests, well, these political bands are easy to dissolve, or it's no big deal, or we can do that on a whim. Right? They're presupposing that the political bands are some of the strongest bands that exist. Normally, to reject the authority of the government under which you live would be a catastrophic maneuver. And of course, this is a very dangerous thing they're doing. It's going to lead to a revolutionary war. And they know they're risking their lives by doing this. So it's a very serious thing, but they're saying it's necessary. We're doing it only because it's necessary. We wouldn't do this if it wasn't necessary. Okay, so what makes it necessary? The laws of nature and of nature's God. So this is precisely the same argument Socrates made to the jury of Athens. I love you, I respect you, but I will obey the God rather than you. And the God is understood as a reasonable God who connects with our human nature, who gave us this nature that we have, which is to reason and understand things. And this is precisely what the authors of the Declaration of Independence are thinking. The laws of nature and of nature's God are known to us through the faculty of reason which is embedded in our nature. And these are higher laws than the political laws, the political authorities and the political bands which bind us. So as high and important and great as the political authority is, it is subordinate to the authority of God and nature. And you can see that here that this is based on reason, because they also say that in doing this, we don't need permission from other people to do this, but a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that we would declare the causes. In other words, that we give the reasoning. We have to show that we have adequate reasons for doing this. Otherwise, we're not showing respect to the opinions of mankind, which goes back to our rational nature, which comes from the laws of nature and nature's God. Okay, so they can't consistently act on the laws of nature and nature's God without showing that they have thought very carefully and that they can give the reasons for what they're doing. So, Nicholas, that was my hopefully not overly complicated synopsis of some interesting people in political philosophy and how they have shaped the world that we live in.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Hebert. It looks like we're out of time here. Do you have any concluding thoughts?
Well, let me say that we've talked a little bit about philosophy and the pursuit of wisdom. And wisdom being a virtue, one of the things that Socrates says about it is really only the God is wise. Right? For human beings, virtues like wisdom are perfections that we can never perfectly attain in this life, but we can always get closer to them. We can always grow in the virtues like wisdom. So I would just encourage the listeners to make a resolution to try to grow each day in wisdom as well as other virtues. And if they're so inclined, I would encourage them to join us at the blog and on this YouTube channel as we're pursuing wisdom. And especially if they have any comments or questions or suggestions for topics that we could be talking about here, then I would very much welcome their input.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hebert. And thank you, everyone, for watching this inaugural podcast of By the Book. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share with others.
Thank you, Nicholas. Appreciate it.